it withdrew with the speed of a big river. Until that day's hour of 4, it rose about 7 times, then gradually became calm. At noon, the sea became quiet. Because we never heard of waves' rising condition, the villagers, old and young, escaped to the shrine. Okay. So Miho Shrine is the highest ground that they have. Okay. It's only a few meters, maybe six feet or so higher than anything else that they have, but it's all they have on the Sanskrit. Okay. Those remaining at Ienomai, which is literally the place in front of the houses, were paying attention to the sea. To the old, we asked, but they said the wave's appearance was unusual, so that the whole village was puzzled. Could this have been what is called a tsunami? For many years, we must remember it well. Furthermore, it is said that wild waves come after earthquakes, but in the village vicinity, earthquake did not happen. The waves did not come up at all on the outer beach. The waves are only strong within Ienomai, which is on the inner beach, on the inside of the peninsula. Nochi ni oite kokoro e tamao beshi. In future, we should keep this in mind. Okay, next slide. Okay, so they seem to have been, fairly clearly hit by a tsunami. And the question is, well, where did it come from? If it didn't come from Japan, if it came from the Japanese coast, they would have felt the earthquake, and then they would have felt the waves. But in this case, they were hit with waves from the open sea. Okay. So these are our choices, all the red choices, right? All the red lines. The tsunami could have come from an earthquake anywhere. Okay. Let's see, one more slide. Okay, but if we look at the Japan tsunami 2 years ago, we can begin to see patterns that help us. Okay, and one of the patterns, so this is a scale here, and the darker the, let's see. Okay, these are basically measures of wave height. Okay, and where it's really dark purple there is where the waves are the tallest. Now, one of the things we see from this slide made by Noah is that the highest waves go out perpendicularly at a 90-degree angle from the fault line at the offshore of a coast. And so offshore of northeast Japan, the waves are kind of heading out, what is that? East, southeast, right? Okay, so we can say, so that the waves that hit Japan 300 years ago must also have had a similar pattern. And so if we go to the next slide, I think that takes us back to the map. That kind of rules out a lot of these other places, right? For example, it's hard to imagine the waves. Well, we would imagine the waves from the South Pacific shooting west, right? And the ones along the Solomons shooting north, and the ones from Alaska going south. And from details of all the records, we know that this is a wave that struck Japan from the north because it's recorded first at about midnight in Japanese villages, and then it sweeps south until it gets to Miho at in the morning, right? Okay, so it pretty much kind of restricts the choices to somewhere along the Americas, right? To have a tsunami source that would produce the right kind of waves going the right direction and sweeping south. And kind of points toward us, right? Okay. We know that Chile doesn't work. Okay, and let's go to the next slide. And one of the reasons is that South America was basically so well known at the time. This is a French map made about 1703, summarizing the world knowledge at the time. And you can see that it's virtually perfect. And that's pretty much the world as we know it today. This is trade routes coming, around South America and across the Pacific. And so the only part of the world that really was an unknown at the time was our part of the world. Right? And once you get north of like Cape Mendocino, somewhere along there, that's about the extent of the Spanish knowledge at the time. Okay, but from the South American records, we know that there was not a big earthquake in South America at the time. Okay. So that pretty much leaves us here as the most likely source of those waves. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is a computer model of what a magnitude 9 earthquake from here would look like, traversing the Pacific and striking Japan. Okay. And it looks just like like the sound that I described, where the waves are kind of pointing south and sweeping south along the Japanese coast. So hitting northern Japan first and then sweeping south. What else? Okay, next slide. Okay, so here finally is where my part of the story comes in. The story so far, it's a great geologic story. Someone and I are involved, geologists are involved in making all those diagrams of the faults and those kinds of things. But it was just a story, and nobody could really tie the Japanese history together with what's happening here. It was all negative evidence, evidence pointing that the wave did not come from other places, and so it was most likely came from here. But nobody could prove that the wave actually came from here. Okay? And so that was my job as a forester. And my entry into this field came from forests like these along the southern Washington coast that were discovered in the late 1980s. Stands of dead western red cedar that are close to the ocean, and they are submerged. Their roots are below high tide level. Okay, so they're on. The best geologic thinking was, well, they are forests next to the ocean that were lowered into the sea by this great earthquake and killed by salt water coming in and attacking their roots. And so if we could figure out when these trees died, the question would be, if these trees died at the same time that someone I wrote down the waves hitting Japan, that would clinch the story. Okay. So that was the challenge I was given. Next slide. Okay, and my approach was to match the tree rings of the hill trees with those of living trees to determine when the dead trees died. Okay. And so the way this works is that when trees are alive, they are just putting on annual rings. We all know this. But they're also, the widths of those individual rings vary depending on the amount of rainfall that happens that summer. And so when you look at a modern tree trunk, for example, like this, you can see that there is that width variation there. And so each tree is recording the climate during its lifetime. And so all you have to do is take a cross-section from a killed tree and then try to figure out where it matches the ring width patterns of live trees. And so this is what I did. And when you do this, it turns out that the outermost ring of the dead trees on the Washington coast is 1699. Okay. The trees were growing fine between May and August, September of 1699. And then in the winter, the waves hit Japan. Okay, and so when it's transcribed, when the Japanese lunar calendar is back calculated to the Western calendar, it turns out to be January 28th in Japan of 1700. And that same winter, the trees died. And so by the summer of 1700, when summer comes again, the trees are all dead. And so everything just fit together, kind of like a dream. And that's part of the scientific basis that's driving all of the engineering infrastructure that has been happening around the Pacific Northwest for the last 20 years or so. The next slide. Okay. Okay. So on our end, we had been struggling with the question of earthquake magnitude before we learned anything about the Japanese tsunami records. And what we could tell on the Pacific side, or on the West Coast side, is that we had been struck by a big earthquake here about 300 years ago that was either magnitude 8 or magnitude 9, but we couldn't tell the difference. Okay. What we can all tell by looking at the map, the Japanese map, is when you look at the extent of coast where the documents that we have describe this one tsunami, which is basically much of the length of Honshu, and you compare that to the tsunami that hit Japan 2 years ago, which is pretty much restricted to the Tohoku coast, it makes sense that the tsunami that we're describing in the past was huge, right? Because it was enough to affect a much larger sector of coast after it crossed an ocean. Next slide. Okay, so that kind of brings us to where we are now. The earthquake improvement, or infrastructure improvement is ongoing. And all of these kinds of improvements are having the same budget battles as every other project in the United States. But this U.S.-Japan connection has played a big role in getting us at least on the right track to being ready for an earthquake and tsunami comparable to the one that hit Japan. And so now it's just a race between building up our engineering infrastructure and Earth, right, to see who will be ready first. Just one closing comment on my role in this. For me, it was just probably the project of a lifetime. I don't know that I will ever top an accomplishment like this, with the time I have left on the planet. But it's one of those things where you realize that there's still a need for Japanese and Japanese Americans who can speak some Japanese anyway, and serve as a go-between between specialists in two countries. The classic example of this was World War II, when suddenly the United States was in a war with Japan, and they realized, hey, wait a minute, we need linguists. Okay, and so a lot of the linguists they approached were the former students of the Seattle Japanese Language School, right up the street here. I grew up going to that school every Saturday morning, and later studied Japanese in college, and later worked in Japan. And it really hit me that there are such times when even now, you can get an email and it will say things like, well, David, can you come to Japan in March and come for 3 weeks and work on this project with us? And it just comes out of the blue. And so you just have to be ready because you don't have time to ramp up your Japanese. And so I think, I guess based on my experience, if there are those of you in the audience that are studying Japanese or have college student kids who are studying Japanese, I think their opportunities will also come, just based on my own life experience. And that I also know that a lot of Nisei growing up made fun of me because they'd see me going to Japanese school and they'd see me studying Japanese on Saturday. And they'd say, well, you're never going to get there. And in retrospect, I now know that a lot of their own Japanese was not so good. And you just have to ignore those folks and just kind of believe in yourself. And then one day you're there. So I think I've talked enough. But that's kind of the gist of what I wanted to say today. I guess I welcome your questions. So thank you.